I wanted to speak in this video about the book of Malachi, a very fascinating book in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is a letter by the last prophet of Israel. In the closing of the Hebrew Scriptures, in particular, Malachi is basically there to warn Israel, the last and final warning before the great time where we would be on our own and go through a lot of persecution and suffering. And Malachi essentially is trying to answer many questions that Israel is having. So when you read the book of Malachi, especially when you read in context, you see that Israel as a whole, as a people, is asking questions. And Elohim, through the prophet Malachi, is answering those questions. Why is there no justice? Why is there no peace? Also questioning God, Elohim himself, saying, how do you love us? How can you say you love us? And Elohim is basically explaining, I loved you because X, Y, and Z. I did this for you and that. You turned your back on me. You committed adultery. It's very, very an emotional roller coaster, so to speak. And you see that Elohim is explaining to Israel what went wrong, what they have done throughout history, and what will continue to happen, how they can correct themselves. And Malachi essentially is basically saying the final farewell, as he is the final conclusion of the prophetic period, so to speak. The very end of Malachi, you see that he says, before I go, it says, remember the Torah of Moshe that was given at Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. In particular, he tells us that the return of Elijah, the prophet, Eliyahu, will come before the great and awesome day of Elohim. Now, as we know in the book of Kings, we see that Elijah, the prophet, Eliyahu, was in a time period where Israel was under a lot of blasphemies, and there was a lot of Baal worship. The worshiping of Baal was huge. The movement of Baal was just rampant at that time. And Elijah the prophet was pleading with Israel to get them correct in the way of Elohim. And so we know in the book of Kings that there was a big, basically a fight, not a fight, but I mean a battle between the true Elohim and the worship of Baal, where two sacrifices were put in place. And we know that the priest of Baal came out, and they were going through great lengths to make their sacrifice happen in front of the eyes of all the people, and they were unsuccessful. So they started slicing their wrists and harming themselves. They were very, very dedicated to Baal worship. And the Israelites were falling into this idolatry. So we know in the end, the Elohim, the true Elohim, YHWH, presented himself as the true and only God by setting the sacrifice on fire and sucking at the water. And so it looked like it was a grand success as far as Elijah saw. The Israelites were wowed by this, and they were moved to cry out to Elohim that he alone was Elohim. And the very next day, they went right back to Baal worship. So therefore, it was a catastrophe. And Elijah, in the book of Kings, we see that Elijah is just overcome with emotion. He's just going, oh my God, they're back at it again. He goes to God, it's over. They have went back to Baal worship, and he tells God, you know what, I did everything. I was all for you. I was dedicated, and so on and so forth. And he basically is given up on Israel. So God, in a sense, I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says, you know what, Elisha's taken over. You're no longer in charge. And therefore, Elohim corrects Elijah and tells him that there were 7,000 people of Israel that did not kiss the hand of Baal. Now, what is the example here being set? That Elohim says, for example, in Zephaniah chapter 12, that there would always be a righteous remnant among Israel. And there always has been. There always has been. This is the righteous remnant of Israel, which is the suffering servant throughout history, which has been us, the Jews, throughout history. Elohim says, no, there will always be a righteous remnant. So therefore, Elijah, was taken to heaven to witness that the covenant would be continued throughout Israel, and that there would always be a righteous remnant. And this is why the tradition came from the Pharisees, which today is the Orthodox Jews, to leave a door open for Elijah. We as Karaites don't follow this tradition, but we are aware and we do agree that Elijah was taken to heaven. And therefore he is to witness that the Israelites were always, there was always going to be a righteous remnant among Israel. We were always going to be keeping the covenant throughout history, suffering, keeping it. And that's exactly what happened throughout history. So when we see this, Elohim says in the book of Malachi, he says very carefully, through Malachi, that keep the law of Moshe and look out for Elijah the prophet, who will be coming back to bring the families of Israel back together, the mothers and fathers, daughters and mothers. You contrast that with the New Testament, the message of Jesus or Yeshua, where he says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword, to turn fathers against sons, sons against fathers, mothers against daughters, and so on and so forth. And in the New Testament, it claims that John the Baptist was Elijah. But we see in John chapter 1, verse 21, that John the Baptist himself says, no, I am not Elijah. I am not a prophet. So the fact of the matter is that Elijah the prophet is coming to bring the families of Israel, all the sects together, to get organized, come together as one before the Messianic age, so we can all be on the same page as far as Torah observance goes, to pick out what exactly is correct and what is not, and come together to true Torah observance before the great day of Elohim. So therefore, reading the book of Malachi is, it's a short book, but it is fascinating. And I really highly recommend you read this for encouragement. The book of Malachi, is the great last prophet who gives us much encouragement throughout our history and gives us comfort that the great day of Elohim will be coming, which will change the course of history and to a positive one. Shalom, and thank you so much for your time.